The gleaming white halls of St. Jude's Trauma Center were a playground for the elite. Here, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy perfume of Ivy League egos. The doctors and nurses who paced these corridors didn't just save lives. They performed for the cameras, their reputations and paychecks far outstripping their humility. To them, the hospital was a stage, and they were the undisputed stars. Into this high-stakes theater walked Elena Vance, Sarah Mitchell. She didn't announce her arrival with a prestigious degree or a flurry of self-importance. Instead, she arrived in silence, wearing standard-issue blue scrubs that looked 2 sizes too big for her wiry, hardened frame. She moved like a ghost, an unsettling presence that seemed to absorb the noise of the room rather than add to it. The staff didn't just ignore her, they were repulsed by her lack of shimmer. The mockery began almost instantly in the Ward 4 West break room. The laughter wasn't quiet, it was sharp and jagged, intentionally loud enough to pierce through the thin drywall so the target would hear every word. I asked her for a clamp, and she handed me a hemostat. Dr. Julian Thorne scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the undisputed golden boy of St. Jude. Thorne was the kind of surgeon who spent as much time curating his Instagram following as he did in the operating theater. I swear, HR is scraping the bottom of the barrel. She looks like she just wandered in from a bus stop. Nurse Jessica Thorne, stirring her oat milk latte, nodded in agreement. She's 45 if she's a day. Who starts a residency or a nursing rotation at that age? She leaned in closer to the group, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And have you seen her hands? They shake. I saw her trembling while prepping an IV tray for a patient, probably the DTs. Alcoholic or burned out, Thorne muttered, checking his luxury watch. Either way, I want her out of my OR. If she touches a patient during a critical procedure, I'm filing a formal complaint. She's not a nurse, she's a liability. Outside the door, Elena stood perfectly still. She had heard every word, the insults about her age, the assumptions about her shaking hands, and the mockery of her appearance. But she didn't blink. There was no flash of anger, no impulse to storm in and defend her dignity. She simply adjusted the collar of her loose scrub top, hiding the scars on her arms that they assumed were from clumsiness. They didn't know that those scars were from shrapnel, not accidents. They didn't know that her hands didn't shake from alcohol, but from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors, a mechanical echo of 20 years spent in the dirt of Kandahar and Fallujah. Elena had been at St. Jude for 3 weeks, and in that time she had spoken less than 100 words. She accepted the grunt work that the younger elite nurses felt was beneath them. She changed bedpans, sanitized surfaces, and restocked carts without a single complaint. She volunteered for the graveyard shifts that no one else wanted, choosing the cold, quiet hours of the night to hide in plain sight. As she picked up her tray of sterilized instruments and walked toward the nurse's station, she was intercepted by Greg, a second-year resident with a permanent smirk. He didn't see a colleague, he saw a servant. "Hey, newbie," Greg called out, tossing a dirty, stained lab coat at her. It landed heavily on her shoulder. "Take that to laundry and grab me a coffee, black, and don't mess it up like you did those charts." Elena stopped. She slowly peeled the coat off her shoulder, her fingers gripping the fabric. For a split second, she looked Greg directly in the eyes. Her eyes, usually a dull, passive gray, suddenly flashed with a cold, metallic steel. It was the look of a predator, the look of someone who had decided whether a man lived or died in the time it took to blink. Greg faltered. His smirk slipped for a fraction of a second as an inexplicable chill ran down his spine. "Coffee," Elena said softly. Her voice was raspy, sounding like gravel moving over velvet. "Yeah, coffee," Greg stammered, his composure crumbling as she walked away. "Freak," he muttered under his breath, trying to regain his ego, but his heart was still racing. The elite of St. Jude's thought they were looking at a broken woman. They had no idea they were looking at Lieutenant Elena Vance, call sign Angel, a former Tier 1 pararescue jumper who had seen more death before breakfast than Thorne would see in his entire career. She had come here for the noise of the monitors to drown out the silence of retirement, promising herself she would never be a hero again. But the universe had other plans. The transition from the mundane to the miraculous often happens in a heartbeat. For Elena, that heartbeat was the sudden rhythmic thrumming that began to vibrate through the floor of St. Jude's Trauma Center. To the elite staff, it was just the sound of a medevac coming in. But to Elena, it was a siren song she hadn't heard in 3 years, the distinct heavy beat of a Pave Hawk military helicopter. Her mop hit the floor with a wet thud. She knew that sound. It wasn't a civilian rescue. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. The hospital's PA system crackled to life with an urgency that silenced the hallways. 3 sharp, piercing blasts echoed through the wards. Code Black, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes. Mass casualty event reported. High-value transfer incoming. The break room emptied in a blur of white coats and expensive sneakers. Dr. Thorne was already in his element, his ego expanding to meet the gravity of the moment. He barked orders like a general, relishing the adrenaline. Jessica, Prep Bay 1, Greg, get the blood bank on the line. We have VIPs coming in from the airfield. Elena stood by her linen cart, a shadow against the wall. She wasn't assigned to the trauma bay, she was assigned to mop-up duty, expected to clean the blood off the floors once the real doctors were finished. But as the sirens wailed closer, her blood turned to ice. She didn't need a briefing to know what was coming. The double doors of the trauma bay burst open. Paramedics rushed in, flanked by 2 massive men in plain clothes, wearing tactical headsets, men who didn't look like they belonged in a sterile hospital. They looked like they had just walked out of a furnace. On the stretcher lay a man who was more wires and blood-soaked gauze than human. Male 40s, multiple gunshot wounds to the thoracic cavity, the lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. BP is 60/40 and dropping fast. We lost his pulse twice in the bird. Thorne stepped up, the golden boy ready for his close-up. I've got this. Clear the way, get a line in him, type and cross-match for Oneg's stat. One of the tactical operators, a bearded giant with a scar running down his neck named Dutch, grabbed Thorne's scrub sleeve with a grip that could crush bone. Doc, Dutch growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You listen to me. This is Commander Marcus Hayes. You lose him, and there is no hole deep enough for you to hide in. Thorne yanked his arm away, his face reddening. Get these men out of my OR. I am trying to save a life here. As security ushered the operators out, the atmosphere in the room turned suffocating. On the table, Hayes was fadding. The monitor screamed a flat, dissonant tone. He's coding, Nurse Jessica screamed. VFib paddles, Thorne yelled, his composure beginning to crack. Charge to 200, clear. Thump, nothing. Charge to 300, come on. Thorne was sweating now, the surgical success rate he bragged about on Instagram suddenly feeling like a fragile glass house. The damage was too extensive. Every time they performed compressions, a fresh spray of arterial blood hit the floor. Where is the bleeder? I can't see anything through this mess, Thorne roared in frustration. Unnoticed in the corner, Elena had slipped into the room. She was supposed to be in the waiting room with a mop, but her eyes were locked on the monitor and the way the blood was pooling. She saw what the elite doctors missed. Thorne was obsessed with the chest wounds, but the commander's abdomen was distended, tight as a drum. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Elena whispered. No one heard her. I said charge to 360, Thorne screamed, his voice bordering on panic. We're losing him. Elena moved. It wasn't a conscious decision, It was 20 years of muscle memory taking the lead. She stepped past Greg, who tried to shove her back. "Get out of here, janitor," he hissed. Elena didn't argue. She drove her shoulder into Greg's sternum with enough force to knock the breath out of him, sending him stumbling into an instrument cart with a loud crash. "Hey," Thorne looked up, eyes wide with rage. "What the hell are you doing, security?" Elena ignored him. She reached the table and looked at the wound on the commander's upper thigh, high near the groin, hidden by the shredded remains of his tactical pants. It was a femoral artery nick, bleeding internally, disguised by the more obvious chest trauma. "He's bleeding out from the femoral," Elena said. Her voice was no longer the raspy whisper of a broken nurse. It was a command. It was the voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack. "Stop compressions. You're just pumping the blood out of him." Thorne was livid. "You are fired. Get away from the patient." Elena didn't flinch. She jammed her entire gloved fist deep into the open wound on the commander's groin. It was a brutal, archaic maneuver designed for the battlefield, not a sterile trauma center. The room went dead silent as she stared Thorne directly in the eyes. "I said, stop compressions. Look at the monitor." Thorne looked. The blood pressure line, which had been flat, gave a small, weak blip. Then another. The massive arterial spray that had been coating the floor slowed to a trickle. By applying direct manual pressure to the artery against the pelvic bone, she had crimped the hose. "He's stabilized," Jessica whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. Elena didn't smile. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly from the sheer physical exertion of holding the pressure, but her grip was iron. "Clamp," Elena said. She didn't ask, she ordered. The silence that followed Elena's command was heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. Dr. Julian Thorne stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the defibrillator paddles. He looked from the monitor, where the commander's heart rate was stabilizing into a weak but steady rhythm, to the new nurse, whose hand was buried wrist-deep in a human body. "I said, clamp," Elena repeated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that cut through the hospital's high-tech hum like a serrated blade. Thorne's ego finally buckled under the sheer reality of the situation. He reached for a vascular clamp, his movements jerky and uncertain. Elena guided his hand with a precision that was terrifying. 2 centimeters up from the bifurcation. "Now, tighten it." As the metal clicked into place, Elena slowly withdrew her hand. Her blue scrub sleeve was soaked a deep, dark crimson. She didn't look at the blood. She didn't look at the shocked faces of the residents. She looked at Commander Marcus Hayes. Her eyes scanned his face, noting the pallor of his skin and the way his eyelids flickered. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had seen the light at the end of the tunnel and was fighting his way back to the dark. "Greg, get the suction," Thorne shouted, trying to regain control of the room. "Jessica, more units of Oneg. We're not out of the woods yet." But the elite team was moving differently now. They weren't looking at Thorne for direction. They were casting sideways glances at Elena. She had moved back to the periphery, standing near the sink, washing the blood from her arms with a methodical calmness that was more unsettling than her outburst. Outside the glass doors of the trauma bay, the 2 tactical operators, Dutch and Miller, were watching through the narrow window. Dutch, the one with the scarred neck, had his arms crossed over his massive chest. He hadn't looked at Thorne once. His eyes were fixed on Elena. "Did you see that?" Miller whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "That move, the junctional pressure, they don't teach that in med school, Dutch. That's a battlefield bypass." Dutch didn't answer immediately. He was watching the way Elena held herself, the slight hunch of her shoulders, the way she stood with her weight shifted off her left leg, a classic sign of a healed spinal injury. He remembered a story from 5 years ago, a legend whispered in the dark corners of JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, about a pararescue jumper who had held a man's carotid artery closed for 6 miles during a fighting extract in the Hindu Kush. They called her the Angel of the Abyss. It can't be, Dutch muttered, his eyes narrowing. She's supposed to be dead or retired in the Maldives. Inside the bay, the immediate crisis had passed. The commander was stable enough to be moved to the ICU. Thorne stepped away from the table, peeling off his bloody gloves. He looked at Alina, who was now quietly restocking a tray of gauze as if she hadn't just performed a miracle. Vance, Thorne said, his voice regaining its arrogant edge. That was highly irregular. You broke a dozen protocols. You put this hospital at massive legal risk by touching a patient without my direct authorization. Alina didn't even look up from the gauze. He would have been dead before your authorization reached your brain, Doctor. The residents gasped. No one spoke to Julian Thorne like that. You're lucky the patient is a VIP, Thorne hissed, leaning in close so the others couldn't hear. If he had died, I'd have you in handcuffs. As it stands, don't think this earns you a seat at the table. You're still a janitor in my eyes. Go clean yourself up. You smell like a slaughterhouse. Alina finally looked at him. A small, chilling smile played at the corners of her mouth. The smell of a slaughterhouse is something you only recognize if you've spent time in one, Julian. You just smell like expensive cologne and cowardice. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay, leaving Thorne vibrating with a mix of fury and an emotion he refused to recognize: fear. As she pushed through the double doors, she found herself face to face with the giant, Dutch. He didn't move out of her way. He stood like a mountain of muscle and tactical nylon. That was a hell of a catch, nurse, Dutch said, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of recognition. Alina kept her face a mask of professional indifference. I'm just doing my job, sir. Please clear the hallway. Is that right? Dutch stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because the last time I saw someone use a fist-load pressure point like that, it was in a dry creek bed outside of Jalalabad. And the woman who did it wore a flight suit, not oversized scrubs. Alina's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't let it show. You must have me confused with someone else. I've never been to Afghanistan. As Alina walked away, Dutch pulled out a secure satellite phone. He didn't call the Pentagon, he called a private number. I found her, he said into the receiver, and you better get here fast, because the people who put those holes in the commander, they aren't done yet, and they're going to come looking for the woman who saved him. The hospital's administrative wing was a world of mahogany desks and glass walls, far removed from the blood and grit of the trauma bay. Dr. Julian Thorne stood in the office of Administrator Marcus Sterling, his face a mask of calculated indignation. She is a loose cannon, Marcus, Thorne said, packing the plush carpet. She shoved a resident, she violated every sterile field protocol we have, and she physically assaulted a patient by jamming her hand into an open wound. If that commander had died, we'd be facing a multi-million-dollar malpractice suit because of a janitor in scrubs. Sterling, a man who cared more about the hospital's endowment than its emergency results, leaned back. But the commander didn't die, Julian. My phone has been ringing off the hook from the Department of Defense. They're calling it a miracle. It wasn't a miracle, it was luck, Thorne shouted, his voice cracking. I had the situation under control. She interfered. If we don't fire her now, we are telling the entire staff that protocols don't matter. Sterling sighed, looking at a stack of papers on his desk. Fine. Her background check was already thin, no previous hospital history, just some vague, private sector consulting. We'll terminate her for conduct unbecoming and safety violations. Have her badge by the end of the shift. Meanwhile, in the ICU, the atmosphere was electric. Commander Marcus Hayes was awake, though heavily sedated. His bed was surrounded by high-tech monitors, but the most imposing presence was Dutch, who stood by the window, watching the hospital entrance like a hawk. "Where is she?" Hayes rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through broken glass. "The nurse," Dutch asked, turning around. "The doctors are trying to bury her boss. The lead surgeon is claiming he's the one who plugged the leak." Hayes let out a weak, dry chuckle that ended in a wince. "That suit, he didn't have the stomach for it. I remember the hand. I remember the pressure. It felt like the angel was back." "I think it is her, Marcus," Dutch said, his voice dropping. "But she's hiding. She's got a different name, a different life. She looks like she's trying to disappear into the drywall." "Don't let her," Hayes whispered, his eyes drifting shut. "Because if they tracked me here, they'll track the person who saved me. They don't leave witnesses." Back in the locker room, Elena was staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. Her hands were still, but her mind was a battlefield of calculations. She knew Thorne wouldn't let her stay. She knew the bureaucracy of a civilian hospital was designed to crush people like her. The door creaked open, and Jessica walked in, holding a manila envelope. She didn't look Elena in the eye. She just tossed the envelope onto the bench. "Administrator wants your badge," Jessica said, her voice filled with a petty, triumphant venom. "You're done here, Angel. You can go back to whatever bus stop you came from, and don't bother asking for a reference. Dr. Thorne made sure you're blacklisted from every hospital in the state." Elena didn't move. She didn't argue. She just picked up the envelope and pulled out her termination notice. "You think you won," Elena said softly, finally looking at Jessica. "I know I did," Jessica smirked. "This is a place for professionals, not for unstable freaks who think they're in a movie." Elena stood up, her presence suddenly filling the small room. She stepped toward Jessica, who instinctively backed into the lockers. "Professionals? You wouldn't know professional if it saved your life. You're a hobbyist, Jessica. You play at medicine, I lived it. And while you're celebrating my firing, you might want to ask yourself why the security team just switched to encrypted channels and why the basement elevators just stopped working." Jessica's smirk vanished. "What are you talking about?" "The code black wasn't an accident," Elena said, her voice cold and hollow. "The men who shot Commander Hayes didn't miss. They intended for him to die, and when they find out he's still breathing, they aren't going to send a lawyer. They're going to send a cleanup crew." At that exact moment, the lights in the locker room flickered and died. The hum of the air conditioning ceased, replaced by a haunting, heavy silence. Then, from the floor below, came the muffled, unmistakable thud of a suppressed gunshot. Elena didn't panic. She reached into her locker and pulled out a small, hidden kit she had kept for 3 years, a kit she hoped she would never have to open again. Inside was a tactical radio, a specialized trauma kit, and a single, razor-sharp scalpel. "Welcome to the graveyard shift, Jessica," Elena whispered into the dark. "Try not to scream." The red emergency lights of St. Jude's flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows down the corridors. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that usually preceded an ambush. Elena Vance stood in the middle of the darkened locker room, her senses heightened. She didn't see the hospital anymore. She saw a tactical environment. She saw entry points, fatal funnels, and cover. "Stay down," Elena whispered to a trembling Jessica. "Don't move, don't talk. If you hear someone coming who isn't me, crawl under that steel bench and hold your breath." Elena slipped out into the hallway. The usual bustle of nurses and the beeping of monitors were gone, replaced by the heavy, methodical footsteps of professional soldiers. These weren't common criminals. They were the Blackwell Group, a private military contractor known for cleaning up loose ends. They had been hired to ensure Commander Hayes didn't live to testify about the botched operation in Yemen. Elena moved with a predator's grace, hugging the shadows. She reached the nurse's station and saw the first operator. He was dressed in grey urban camo, carrying a suppressed submachine gun, his movements fluid and disciplined. He was checking the rooms, looking for Hayes. Elena didn't have a firearm yet, but she had something better, knowledge of the terrain. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small glass vial of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic she had swiped from the crash cart. She taped it to the handle of her surgical scalpel. As the operator turned the corner toward the ICU, Elena acted. She didn't engage him head-on. She used a distraction, a heavy metal tray she kicked down the opposite hall. The operator spun toward the noise, and in that split second, Elena was on him. She didn't go for a flashy takedown. She drove the scalpel into the soft tissue of his shoulder, right where the body armor gapped. She depressed the vial. The man's eyes went wide. Within seconds, his nervous system disconnected. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Elena caught him before he hit the floor, preventing any noise. She stripped him of his radio and his suppressed HK-416 rifle. "Team leader, this is Echo 4, a voice crackled in the earpiece. "Status on the target." Elena didn't answer. She knew the silence would trigger an alarm, but she needed time. She sprinted toward the ICU. Inside the ICU, Dr. Julian Thorne was hiding under a desk in the observation room, his expensive scrubs soaked in cold sweat. He had watched through the glass as two Blackwell men entered the commander's room. He had done nothing. He was paralyzed by the very fear he used to mock in others. But then, the door to the observation room hissed open. Thorne let out a muffled whimper. "Get up, Julian," a voice commanded. Thorne looked up to see Elena. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She was covered in tactical gear she had stripped from the operator, the heavy rifle held with a familiarity that was terrifying. "Vance, what are you doing? They're going to kill us," Thorne blubbered. "They're here for Hayes," Elena said, her eyes scanning the monitors. "And because you saw their faces, they're here for you too. If you want to live, you do exactly what I say. I need you to go into that room and prep the commander for transport. I'll provide cover." "I can't, they have guns." Elena grabbed Thorne by the collar, pulling him inches from her face. "I have a gun too, Julian, and right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and a body bag. Move, now." As Thorne stumbled into the commander's room, Elena took up a position by the door. She saw the laser sights of the Blackwell team painting the walls at the end of the hallway. There were 3 of them left on this floor. "Dutch, do you read me?" Elena whispered into the stolen radio, switching to the SEAL's frequency. "Angel," Dutch's voice came through, filled with relief and static. "We are pinned in the stairwell. They used thermite on the doors. We're blocked." "I've got the commander," Elena replied, her finger tightening on the trigger. "But the floor is hot. I'm initiating an emergency extract. Meet me at the service elevator in 3 minutes, or don't come at all." Just as she finished the transmission, a flashbang grenade bounced into the hallway. Crack! The world turned white. Elena felt the heat of the blast, but she didn't close her eyes. She fired into the white light, knowing that the real battle for St. Jude had only just begun. The flashbang's roar was still ringing in Elena's ears as she pulled Dr. Julian Thorne and the semi-conscious Commander Hayes into the service elevator. The hallway behind them was a mess of smoke and whistling bullets. Elena slammed her fist against the B2 button, the sub-basement where the massive industrial generators and morgue were located. "Why are we going down?" Thorne shrieked, cowering in the corner of the elevator, his hands over his ears. "The police will be at the front entrance. We need to go up to the roof." "The police aren't coming, Julian," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the floor indicator as it ticked downward. The Blackwell Group has jammed the local precinct's comms and looped the security footage. To the outside world, this hospital looks perfectly normal. If we go to the roof, we're just sitting ducks for their chopper." The elevator doors groaned open into the dark, damp belly of the hospital. The air here was cold and smelled of diesel fuel and old concrete. "We need to get to the boiler room," Elena commanded, grabbing one side of Hayes's wheelchair. "Thorne, grab the other side. If he falls, he dies. Move." As they hurried through the labyrinth of pipes, a voice echoed through the basement's PA system. It wasn't the calm hospital announcer. It was a cold, cultured voice with a British accent. "Lieutenant Vance," the voice said, reverberating off the concrete walls. "Or should I call you Angel? My name is Vane. I'm the lead contractor for the Blackwell Group. I must say, your file said you were retired, but that work in the trauma bay, that was poetry. Why die for a man who's already a ghost? Hand over the commander, and I'll let you walk out of here. I'll even let the golden boy doctor go back to his Instagram fans." Thorne froze. He looked at Elena, then at the dark hallway, then at the commander. "Vance, maybe we should talk to them. They just want him. If we give him up, we live." Elena stopped and turned toward Thorne. In the dim emergency light, she looked like a shadow come to life. She didn't say a word. She simply raised the HK-416 and pointed the barrel directly at Thorne's forehead. "The next word out of your mouth better be, 'How can I help?'" she said, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "Because I've left men better than you in the dirt for less." Thorne swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "How can I help?" "Keep his foreline clear and keep him awake," Elena ordered, turning back to the darkness. "We're going to set a trap." Elena knew Vane would be tracking them via the hospital's thermal sensors, which were on a separate backup loop. She found the main steam valve for the hospital's heating system. Using a heavy wrench, she loosened the safety bolts. "Dutch, come in," she whispered into her radio. "We've breached the stairwell, Angel. We're on the ground floor, but we're taking heavy fire from the lobby," Dutch's voice crackled. "Get to the loading dock," Elena said. "I'm going to vent the steam in the sub-basement. It'll blind their thermals and create a heat signature mask. You'll have a 60-second window to get a vehicle to the service ramp. Go." She heard the footsteps then, methodical, heavy. Vane and two of his remaining men were entering the boiler room. "I know you're here, Elena," Vane's voice drifted through the pipes. "I can smell the copper from the commander's bandages. You're a medic. You're trained to save lives, not take them. Don't ruin your streak." Elena waited until she saw the red glow of their night vision goggles. She didn't fire her gun. Instead, she swung the wrench with all her might, shearing off the main steam bolt. A deafening roar filled the room as superheated steam exploded outward, filling the basement in a white, blistering cloud. Screams of agony erupted from Vane's men as the 200-degree mist hit their skin. In the chaos, Elena grabbed the commander's chair and began to run, but a hand suddenly reached out of the mist and grabbed her throat, slamming her against a concrete pillar. It was Vane, his face red and peeling, his eyes filled with a psychotic rage. The grip on Elena's throat was like a steel vice. Vane, the Blackwell leader, was no longer the composed professional. He was a burnt, desperate animal. The steam hissed around them, creating a white purgatory where the only thing real was the struggle for breath. "You ruined everything," Vane hissed, his face a map of blistering skin. He raised a serrated tactical knife, the blade gleaming even in the dim emergency light. Elena didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for the living, and right now she was a machine of pure survival. She didn't try to pull his hand away, she leaned into the pressure, using his own momentum against him. She reached up, not for his eyes or his throat, but for the pressure point behind his elbow. With a precise, agonizing squeeze, she forced his arm to lock. The knife clattered to the concrete floor. Elena delivered a sharp, upward knee to Vane's ribs, hearing the satisfying crack of bone. She spun away, gasping for air, her lungs burning from the heat and the exertion. A few feet away, Dr. Julian Thorne was paralyzed. He was huddled behind the commander's wheelchair, watching the most decorated mercenary in the private sector trade blows with the woman he had called a liability. For the first time in his life, Thorne realized that his Ivy League degrees and his high-tech surgical tools were useless. In this world, the real world, Elena was the queen, and he was just a spectator. "Thorne," Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the hiss of the steam. "The loading dock is 50 yards down that hall. Go, now." "But Vane, he'll kill you," Thorne stammered. "He'll try," Elena said, her eyes locked on Vane as he rose slowly from the ground, drawing a secondary sidearm. "But if you don't get the commander to that ramp, it won't matter. G.O." Thorne looked at the commander, whose face was ghostly pale. Hayes opened one eye, his hand weakly reaching out to grab Thorne's scrub top. "Move, Doc," Hayes whispered. "She's got this." Something shifted in Thorne. Perhaps it was the shame of his previous cowardice, or perhaps it was the raw, infectious bravery of the woman standing in front of him. He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and sprinted toward the loading dock, leaving Elena alone in the mist with the monster. Vane leveled his pistol at Elena. "You're out of ammo, Angel. I saw you drop the rifle." "I don't need ammo for you," Elena said. She reached into the pocket of her oversized scrubs and pulled out the 2 defibrillator paddles she had scavenged from the service elevator's emergency kit. She had rigged them with a bypass from the industrial generator's battery bank. Vane laughed, a dry, raspy sound. "What are you going to do? Give me a checkup." "I'm going to jumpstart your heart," Elena replied, "at about 5,000 volts." Vane lunged, firing a shot that grazed Elena's shoulder. She ignored the searing pain, stepped inside his guard, and slammed the paddles against his wet, steam-soaked tactical vest. The discharge was blinding. A blue arc of electricity bridged the gap between the paddles and Vane's chest. His body went rigid, his nervous system overwhelmed by a surge of power that would have powered a city block. He flew backward, crashing into a row of metal lockers before falling silent, smoke rising from his gear. Elena didn't wait to see if he was breathing. She turned and ran toward the loading dock. As she burst through the final set of doors, she saw a black SUV skidding to a halt at the bottom of the ramp. Dutch and Miller jumped out, rifles raised, providing a wall of lead against the Blackwell reinforcements coming from the street. "Get him in," Dutch roared. Thorne helped lift the commander into the back of the SUV. He turned to look for Elena, expecting her to jump in with them. But she stayed on the ramp, her silhouette framed by the red emergency lights of the hospital. "Vance, get in, we're leaving," Thorne yelled. "The hospital still has patients, Julian," Elena said, her voice calm as the chaos swirled around her. "There are 3 more operators in the north wing. If I leave, they'll burn this place down to hide the evidence. You take him, I'm finishing this." Dutch looked at her, a silent understanding passing between the 2 warriors. He snapped a salute, a real, crisp military salute. "Give 'em hell, Valkyrie," he shouted. The SUV sped away, leaving Elena standing alone against the darkness. She picked up a fallen operator's radio and keyed the mic. "All Blackwell units, this is Lieutenant Vance. I've neutralized your leader. If you want to leave this hospital alive, you have 60 seconds to drop your weapons. If you don't, well, you've heard the stories about the Angel. I'm about to show you why they're true." The silence that followed Elena's radio transmission was more terrifying than the gunfire. In the upper wings of St. Jude, the remaining Blackwell operators looked at each other, the bravado of their high-priced gear crumbling. They had heard the legends of the Angel of the Abyss, back in their PMC barracks, stories of a ghost who navigated firestorms to pull men from the brink of death. Now that ghost was hunting them in the dark. Elena didn't wait for them to surrender. She didn't have to. She moved through the north wing like a shadow, using the hospital's pneumatic tube system to launch makeshift flash distractions. By the time she reached the third operator, the man was so panicked he was firing at his own reflection in the glass of the neonatal unit. Elena dropped him with a single, non-lethal strike to the temple. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of bruised purple and gold, the sounds of real sirens finally pierced the air. Local police and federal agents, tipped off by the SEAL team's encrypted burst transmission, swarmed the hospital grounds. Inside, the lights flickered back to full power. The elite staff emerged from their hiding spots, blinking like owls in the sudden brightness. Dr. Julian Thorne stood in the lobby, his clothes torn and his ego shattered. He watched as the FBI led the remaining Blackwell mercenaries out in zip ties. "Where is she?" Thorne asked an agent, his voice trembling. "The nurse, Elena Vance. She saved this entire building." The agent checked his digital manifest. "There's no Elena Vance on the staff list, Doctor. We have a Sarah Mitchell listed as a temporary nursing assistant, but she hasn't checked out." Thorne ran to the locker room, followed by Greg and Jessica. They found the door to Elena's, or Sarah's, locker standing wide open. Inside, there were no nursing books or stethoscopes. There was only a single, faded photograph of a flight crew standing in front of a Pave Hawk helicopter and a small silver pin in the shape of a set of wings. Taped to the mirror was a small, blurry security camera still. It showed Sarah standing amidst the smoke of the boiler room, holding a defibrillator paddle like a shield, her face a mask of unbreakable resolve. Underneath it, someone had written one word in black marker: respect. Months later, St. Jude's had changed. The culture of mockery was gone, replaced by a somber humility. Dr. Thorne had resigned from surgery, moving into research, his Instagram account deleted. Greg and Jessica never looked at a new hire the same way again. Far away at a quiet coastal veterans retreat, Commander Marcus Hayes sat on a porch, looking out at the ocean. His leg was scarred, but he was walking. A woman approached him, carrying 2 coffees. She wasn't wearing scrubs, she wore a simple flight jacket. "You took your time, Valkyrie," Hayes said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. Elena Vance, Sarah Mitchell, sat down beside him. "The paperwork for dying and coming back to life takes a while, Marcus." They sat in silence, the kind of silence that only warriors understand. The world would never know what happened that night at St. Jude. The media reported it as a botched robbery, and the hospital administration buried the details to avoid a scandal. But for those who were there, the legend of the nurse who was a soldier would never fade. This story isn't just about a hospital siege. It's about the invisible battles people fight every day. Sarah Mitchell represents the thousands of veterans who walk among us, carrying skills and burdens we cannot see. The doctors judged her by her silence, mistaking her trauma for weakness and her humility for incompetence. In a world obsessed with status and ego, she reminds us that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply steps up when the fire starts. They judged her by her silence, but she saved them with her strength. If you believe our veterans are the true unsung heroes, hit that like button right now. How would you have handled Dr. Thorne? Let us know in the comments and type Valkyrie if you watched until the end. Subscribe for next week's mystery, the homeless man who was a chess grandmaster. Thanks for watching.